If you don't really see an end to climate change and you're sick of the doom and gloom, you're not alone. It's easy to feel like these problems are just too big, too complex to solve. But if history has taught us anything, is that we have faced huge challenges before, and we found ways to overcome them. We can do that again by stepping back and looking at the data. And even more importantly, daring to dream what the future might look like when we do fix climate change.
Is climate action really about action, or is it about changing the way people perceive the world and think what's possible? Adaptation, to me, is about global imagination. Like, how do we introduce new ideas that are actually positive? What is going to happen once we do these things?
Today on the show, we're joined by Dr. Johanna Nalau, an adaptation scientist based at Griffith University and a true leader in this space. She also played a critical role as one of the lead authors for the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6 assessment report. Johanna is here to help us rethink how we prepare for a sustainable future, how we can find a path forward in a time when it feels like all the odds are just stacked against us. Here's our conversation with a visionary in climate adaptation.
I'm kind of known in the field for questioning things. Why do we think this way? Why do we think this is effective response to climate change? Why do we think that we need to adapt? Or why do we think about the world the way we do? So a lot of the research I do is trying to help people to rethink the future. What does it mean to live and think and imagine a changing climate?
What is something that you feel is important for us to highlight when it comes to, where does climate mitigation end and where does climate adaptation start?
That's a very loaded question to a scientist.
Let's dissect it.
Yeah. Well, most of the conversations we have around climate change, it is around reducing emissions, because obviously the emissions are the problem why we have climate change in the first place. But a lot of the conversations in the recent years in particular is really understanding that there is mitigations of reducing emissions, but then the other side of it is like some of the impacts of climate change are already here. So we are seeing increasing number of storms, they're increasing in intensity and frequency heat waves. It's just global temperature. So how do we start adapting to those impacts? So the adaptation conversation is becoming, I think, more and more relevant now that people are seeing the impacts and are starting to think, well, if I live in an area where my garage or my basement is going to flood 5 times a year, what am I going to do? And so those kind of, experiences, but also thinking about the future. So that's very much what adaptation is for. It's like, how do we make better decisions today that can keep us safer in the future?
Climate adaptation, to me, I feel like is sort of the only real option at this point. I mean, obviously mitigation as far as cutting CO2 emissions and trying to think ecosystems first and sort of circular systems first, moving away from the sort of consumption only, and then we create all this waste and sort of forget about it. All of that, to me, sort of plays into the idea of climate adaptation. But the thing I see the most, I would say, in the field is little things that people don't think about. Like, everybody, I think, at this point is aware of plastic and microplastics and the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and that sort of thing. But I think there's a lot of smaller things where it's like, lawns and stuff in the US especially, where they're a monoculture. And so you're seeing these huge changes in insect populations. And just things like that, where little things we do day to day that don't necessarily, you don't necessarily think of as like this big climate impacting thing, but they add up over time. I guess kind of a question from that would be what is the balancing act between net zero versus, just having more native plants in your yard?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm always when people say, well, what is this against that? I'm always like, what can be both? But with adaptation, it's interesting because it is very context specific. So we talk about, one person's or community's adaptation is not going to look similar. But with your example of the grass, so I've seen a lot of people posting about, we need to have like lawns that have all types of flowers and high grass, so the insects and can live there. And I would love to have, like in my house, I would love to have this kind of, wild patch in front of my house. But then one of my Australian friends said, well, you'll get snakes. So like we have to, apparently, like that's one of the reasons why we have to keep the grass short. And I'm like, but I wanted the wildflower field. And she's like, no, that will attract a lot of snakes and your neighbor's not going to be happy. But I think it is those kind of small changes. And I think there are a lot of, when we talk about how do we scale climate action, I think there are these small things that we, like you said, like we've just grown with that. Like we have to always cut the grass. This is what lawn looks like. This is how you water your lawn. But I think there's so many small actions that are based on the culture that if we would change that in the country or in a global scale, we would see mass benefits for ecosystems as well. A lot of the conversation often, I feel like it is very very focused on humans. It's like how, the well-being of humans, but we kind of sometimes forget that we don't live in isolation. Like whatever we do, like we have to think about humans / ecosystems. Like, it is our health and our well-being is so connected to ecosystem services that we don't, because people who grow up in cities, maybe we don't think about that as much. And that's why I love working with some of my Indigenous colleagues on climate adaptation, because their worldview is completely different. They're like, this adaptation action is not separate from nature. It's like we are trying to do something where we respect the environment that's part of us. And that's been, I think, one of the big lessons for me, working with this kind of different cultures and different worldviews.
It's actually funny because I think in Australia, like everything is trying to kill you in the outside. At least that's the meme, right? But what you say there about like nature, very much nature-based solutions, and I remember this from my class back in the day. We were talking about these ecosystem builders and working, for example, like planting more mangroves to make sure that there's less erosion and protection for storms. But like you said, I think those are all very much nature-based solutions, which are very context specific. What we can use here in Belgium is not going to be the same that you can use in Australia or in Texas. What are some approaches that are important there, especially when you're working with people who might not understand the scientific nuances when it comes to that?
I think that's a great observation, because we are increasingly seeing global discussion on ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions. And it seems to be every donor goes, mangroves, let's plant more mangroves. And we're like, but some places do not have mangroves. And we've seen cases where they have planted mangroves because that's what you do. And they planted mangroves in ecosystems that don't have mangroves. And so the actual ecosystem changes, and sometimes quite abruptly. So I think it's always, when we talk about adaptation, it's always, and especially with Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a lot of the, what we look at, it is this kind of big trends. So what strategies overall could work for climate adaptation, but then also always bearing in mind that we have to look at the kind of, what's on the ground first and try to understand, well, what is the problem? Because I think people have very different perceptions what a problem is. And I was reading this book on communication, and they said, don't bring problems to people. Like every person has 99 problems. And so when you talk about climate change and you talk about how bad it is and what a big problem it is, a lot of the times people go, well, that's now I have 100 problems. It's like, how do we talk about climate adaptation in a way that is empowering and that is, that there are solutions, but that we need to have that conversation now. But I think a lot of the public discourse has been quite discouraging often. And it is very much has been, especially on the emission side, it has been very much blaming the individual. Like, you are doing bad things, you should stop. Whereas then we don't kind of look at corporations We don't look at the fossil fuel lobby. We don't look at the actual interest groups that are doing a lot of this behind the scenes, but we then really focus on the individual. And I think that has been one of the big fallacies. Like individual action has obviously impacts, but I think sometimes we misplace our understanding where the biggest kind of points of change are.
I mean, I got a lot of questions. I got a lot of thoughts on this. I've thought about this, and I've sort of shaped my work, I think, around this topic and specifically this sort of line of discussion. But it seems like everything is pointing to the fact that our current civilization is just unsustainable, and we're used to it, which is the scary thing. We're used to just being able to fill a car up with gas in 5 minutes and drive down the road and hop on an airplane and fly across the world and get, things in plastic packaging and, order something from China and it shows up at your doorstep. And I worry that's not going to be the future. And I don't necessarily worry because it's convenient and I don't want to lose the convenience, but I feel like as a society, people are going to try and cling to that for as long as possible. To me, part of climate adaptation is learning to kind of slow down. Like, is that reasonable? From what you've seen, what are your thoughts?
I really like that. The adaptation is about slowing down, because I often think about adaptation as a chance to rethink. And what are the futures like? And one of the initiatives where I'm in the advisory group is Resilience Frontiers. That's United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's one of their initiatives, and that's all about rethinking what does the world look like, in the future, and what are the changes that we can make across, different sectors and different ways of thinking. And I think being involved with that initiative always gives me hope, because it is about seeing the world in a different way. And one of my really good friends said to me, is climate action really about action, or is it about changing the way people perceive the world and think what's possible? And that always, to me, is adaptation. To me, is about global imagination. Like, how do we introduce new ideas that are actually positive? That, so often we talk about the future, but a lot of the times we can't articulate what a thriving future looks like. We just say, we need these policy processes, we need these changes, but we don't talk about the big vision, like what is going to happen once we do these things. And I think there is such a power with like film, for instance. There's such a power in film, changing how people feel in that moment, opening their kind of minds to new ideas. So I think there's so many leverage points that we should be looking at, rather than going, the change is only going to come from individuals. No, the change is only going to come from NGOs, or the change is only coming from the private sector. I think that we have to kind of think about kind of layered possibilities for change, but also, like, I'm more and more passionate about the role of imagination in what we do, but also how we can drive action, but also help other people to understand, well, what would that world look like if we change the way that we did things? And a lot of the times those images can be like really positive, and people go, well, yes, that's, oh my God, like that is the future that we want. But often we kind of, like I said, we start from the problem basis and say, there's this massive problem, it's a global problem. And then we say, countries are not doing enough. And I think it's quite often disempowering, but like we do need the pressure groups, we do need the NGOs, the activists being vocal, for instance, at the negotiations, and really calling out the rhetoric that, there is around climate change. And they're saying, we are doing all these great things and, investing so much in renewables. But then when you look at the investments in fossil fuels, yes, we are investing in renewables, but at the same time, the fossil fuel investments are also going up. So I think it's a complex issue, but I feel like there are so many good people out there who are trying to make a difference through different platforms and mediums.
I love that, by the way. And I love something that really connected with me that you just said was the role of sort of imagination. And I think just the role of dreaming I think is very overlooked whenever it comes to innovation and sort of the evolution of how we do things. Because even just from a tech standpoint, you think of so many innovations over the past 30 years that have come from science fiction. You think about Star Trek with the flip phones and stuff like that, and it sort of informs people on what the world could look like. But I feel like that's also very culturally contextualized. So the imagination of an American is probably vastly different from the imagination of, indigenous folks that you work with. The thing to kind of prod there is, what are some of the dreams or things that you see coming from more indigenous populations regarding climate adaptation?
From the indigenous perspective, it's just like the principle of respect, towards nature, and not having, that kind of, okay, we're just going to bulldoze this whole habitat that's, for koalas so we can build a car park. It's very much about how do we make these decisions so that we live with nature. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm very passionate about. It is the role of like, how do we then blend these different imaginations in these kind of public forums where I've spoken, for instance, at the COP28 in Dubai. That was one of the conversations. It's like different countries, different cultures have different imaginations. Like, how do we bring those together? And I think for me, it's always when I look at future images of cities with, for instance, with Midjourney, I do see, there's clean water, like healthy ecosystems. There's particular things I feel like that are universal. And then whatever elements there are, might be culture specific, kind of the balance, living and imagining a balance and respect towards ecosystems. I think that's definitely something that I feel we need to bring into these conversations. And you're absolutely right. The role of imagination is overlooked in so many times. And even in climate adaptation, we do this stakeholder workshops and talk about climate change scenarios in the future. And somehow the basic expectation or assumption is that every person in that room shares the same imagination, and that every person who's in that room will see the kind of world in a similar way. It's just, we just give them a scenario and then they just come up with solutions. Whereas I think more realistically, we are not kind of going through that first process of values and also having a discussion. Well, what does that world look like to you where you would feel that you would be thriving? And that's why Resilience Frontiers has been really, really important globally as well, because it is, challenging us to reimagine the world, but in a way that, we actually focus on the thriving rather than the kind of, negative views. And in these climate negotiations, so we've run the Resilience Lab a few times, and I just remember in one of the negotiations, so we asked two questions. So first question was, what does the world look like when it's 2040 and we have failed? And every person in that lab put their hand up and said, oh, let me tell you, like, there is no water. All the ecosystems were destroyed. They all had an answer. And then I flipped the question and I said, okay, what does the world look like 2040 when we have aced all the SDGs, when we have achieved this kind of balance with nature? What does the thriving future look like? No hands. And I think that to me is scary, because I feel like that's where the kind of gap in imagination is. And I'm super passionate, and it's something that I'm more and more like interested to research. It's like how do people imagine the future, and how does that alone kind of impact what we think is feasible or what we should be doing with climate adaptation?
I love that.
Yeah, this turns me straight back to the conversation we had with Ryan, Charlie. So for you, Johanna, I guess like this is something you've probably also seen in your work. That conversation was mainly based around human behavior, and everything comes back to like, what's your learning history? And I think like now we have this communal general learning history that is this nihilistic view that Charlie described at the beginning. And if we don't start to change that worldview, it's difficult for people to imagine what a nice world could be.
Like one of the really impactful books I read last year was Artificial Wisdom by Tom Weaver. And it's about a world in 2050, a world government that's about to happen. But it's also describing the world. And I'm so interested in how movies and documentaries how they do the world building. And I think that's really interesting because, I'm always like a massive advocate for books. And I know my mentor always says you need to stop reading and start writing. But I'm like, I think books and movies in particular, like that's when people go to relax. And I think that's where you have one of the biggest kind of leverage points for impact.
Get them when they don't expect it.
Yes.
Yes, Tom, make it as ominous as possible.
Well, yeah, besides that joke, I think it's safe to say that envisioning futures and having new ideas is something that we as creatives have a lot of fun with. So I do have a question for you, but I'm keeping that for a little bit later on in the podcast, because first, let's zoom out again. In our previous episode, we saw how the state, market, civil society all work together in shaping how we react to climate change. So we wanted to ask Johanna's take on, well, what's holding us back? What's getting in the way of making the moves that we need to make to get to the positive version of 2040?
There's kind of two levels. So kind of heuristic that adaptation is a local issue. And I think we see a lot of people championing for local action, which I, again, think that's one of the ways to affect change. But it then depends on the planning rules and the legislation and, what is even possible. So we've seen in China, for instance, they decide we are going to have sponge cities and we are going to build these completely sustainable cities and this year. And we'll build 200 of them like that. In Australia, no, you have planning regulations, like things has to be built in a particular way. So I think changing the rules of the game is kind of the first step. But then also realizing and recognizing who has the responsibility and power to change what. So for instance, in where I live, so local governments in Australia are not recognized in the Constitution. So in Queensland state, it is the state that decides whether a local government's planning scheme should go ahead as it is. So when we talk about local action and then local planning, I think we have to also look at the governance context, and adaptation governance is one of the kind of key focuses as well that really needs attention. Is like, yes, we can do things locally, but if the state would say, well, no, actually, we will not be approving your planning scheme. We will not be approving these changes that you want to make. And we've had these cases where different local governments, for instance, want to consider different levels of sea level rise. So some local governments say, well, actually, having a look at the latest IPCC reports, no, we have to change and we have to plan for 1.5 meters by 2100, and the state says, well, no, all of you will go to 0.8 meters because that's kind of the golden standard. So I think understanding adaptation governance is really crucial to understand where can you make what changes, and also identify what the barriers are. And there has been a lot of research going into adaptation barriers and constraints for years. So I think we know a lot about the problems. I think where we need to kind of shift is, right, these are the problems. So what are the actual solutions? And what are some of the innovative ways to overcome them, rather than go, well, we can't do anything because, there's this regulation. Is starting to think, well, what are some of the more innovative ways that we could demonstrate that this change is actually going to be hugely positive if we make that?
Can you give me an example of a regulation that's standing in the way and an example of a policy change that has been effective?
Good question. Well, I think a lot of countries, especially coastal countries and coastal communities, struggle with water. Whether it's water coming from the sea, whether that's coastal erosion, whether it's inland flooding. One of the really interesting cases, I think, that we also highlight in IPCC is the Netherlands made a policy change. So instead of going like, we're just going to build higher and higher dikes and, and levees and, to control water, they said, what about living with water, like making space for water? So that's actually one of their new policies. So it's very much kind of changing the way that the whole policy community and the regulations looked at water and what does that mean? So one of our IPCC scientists often talks about, there's a case in UK. So Mike Moorcroft, so he has this really, really nice example of kind of more transformative change. So agricultural land that's coastal, that was kept being inundated. So they actually made a land use change decision and said this land no longer will be used for agriculture. This land will now be used for kind of ecosystem-based adaptation. So what that meant was that they changed the whole land use into kind of conservation instead. So, and that's increased, the bird species that are there. It's like the whole ecosystem is becoming healthy. Lots of tree planting, and it actually starting to attract tourists as well. So there's like an income generation part to it as well. But also, like, one of the biggest barriers often is how people view the landscape. So it's not a thing that happens overnight. Imagine these farmers that have been farming, it's their land, they've been farming for generations. And so for them to go, I'm just gonna kind of change the way I think about this land. I mean, it's a very big shift in your mindset as well. And I think that's why a lot of the times we say, well, like, we have to have these conversations with the communities. It can't be just regulations that says overnight, right, like, all this coastal area, you can't use it for this anymore that you've done for generations. It is more about, like, how do we bring people into this journey and say, change is not necessarily bad. Like, even if we, it's not the same as it used to be. Because I think humans are paradoxical in a way that we love change, but we actually don't want to have change. So, but then change is people say change is the only constant in life. So we kind of hang on to these routines and feel out of place when things change. But sometimes, I think it is about that kind of role of imagination. Well, what else could it be? Like, what if this change that we talk about actually is a super positive thing? And if we take that step, we can kind of see something else.
No, that was an observation that I sort of came to with a project I worked on. It was a film about sea turtle conservation in Mexico. One of the main threats of that particular sea turtle population was people consuming the turtles and consuming the eggs for food. Very rural part of Mexico, and that was a food source for a lot of the people that lived there. Over time, through sort of working with local communities to shift the mindset, now it's considered almost taboo to do that. And instead, the locals actually protect the eggs and protect the turtles. And I thought that was really interesting. It's like a top-down approach isn't necessarily always the best, to just say, no, nobody touch the turtles, because then if that just happens overnight, there's going to be pushback.
It's also about giving options, because I feel like a lot of the times we just focus on, like, okay, what is the problem? Rather than going, well, there's also a solution, but there's also that will open different types of options for you. And I think we often miss out on the option part, because we are so focused on, on the problem and kind of the policy or rules that need changing, but then don't kind of highlight the future and say, well, actually, this is there are all these positive outcomes if we do that.
What it seems to be coming back, at least in my mind, is very much to this us versus them is like the standard. We need more connecting language in between that. Just like a lot of people skills, I feel like, to get these different types of people to work together a bit more. Are there some things that you found that are interesting ways for us scientists to have that connecting language with the policymakers to actually get these approaches and these strategies across more?
I mean, I think my answer is probably lame. But I think it's just like basic, like what you said, basic people skills, like listening. and trying to actually understand where that person's coming from. Because a lot of the times I think we as scientists, we think, oh, but we have the science. We've told you what to do. So, in theory, you should be able to do this. But we often
Why
don't.
are you not listening to me?
Yeah, and it's so we always say, understand the decision context. Like if you don't understand that person's, what decisions do they have to make? And so what type of information would be useful? And so IPCC often gets a bad rap because they say, policymakers go and say, well, you're not telling us what to do. I need to be told what to do. You're just telling me all this science and you're telling me all these, there's like 100 different adaptation strategies. But what I need is to understand what would work in my context. So I think it's sometimes it's like we talk past each other. And no, IPCC is apolitical. It's not supposed to tell any country what to do, but it is, saying this is what the science says about these options, and it is trying to, deliver that information and in a form that's more digestible. And I think in this 7th assessment cycle, I think we are going to see a lot more focus on, well, how do we communicate the science that goes into these assessments. But it's also being more mindful also as a scientist, going like, I can present the science, but if I don't understand what that person or what the policy community actually needs, and this we see over and over again, that if we don't understand the questions that they're asking, it's really difficult to answer them. Like, because scientists have their own curiosities and kind of like, oh, we should look at this and we should look at that. But then, sometimes that's not answering kind of the policy need or the information need. But then again, I know that we shouldn't be dictated either, because some of the questions they might be asking might be something that they just want the information to make sure that they can keep going as they are. So I think part of the role of science is also, challenging some of these assumptions and status quo that is out there.
Is there something you feel like that could be beneficial from the policy side, talking to the scientists?
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think it's also understanding the limits of science. So I think there are also assumptions from the policy community. For instance, on the climate scenarios is one of the popular ones is, well, just give me the number. And so what date or what year does this island go under? And we're like, it doesn't work that way. So I've been asked those types of questions sometimes by policymakers, and they say, well, all I need to do is just give me the year. I'm like, I can't give you the year. A lot of what we are talking is about future scenarios, and there's so many different components that go into these models to build the scenarios, but also wildcards. So a lot of us, except in the health research community, but a lot of people just were completely unaware of pathogens like COVID. Completely unaware. And it just hit the whole world, and everyone's like, I didn't, so there's this really funny joke that goes, nobody in 2015, when they were doing their 5-year visioning plan, nobody would say in 2020, I will be alone at home and I'm not allowed to leave. Like that was not in anybody's kind of, future career plan.
Bingo.
So I think, there is also understanding, kind of how the scientific process works, but also what some of the limits are. Because I think there is a lot of pressure, in particular on climate change community, but also on adaptation. There's so much pressure that we have to have perfect 100% certain answers. And if we don't deliver that certainty, then it's like, well, the science uses for my decision making. In other fields, we are more than happy to accept like 50-50. And we're like, okay, well, when it comes to cybersecurity, when it comes to all other policy issues, I feel like there's so much more flexibility in terms of certainty. But when it comes to climate change, they kind of go, well, if you can't give me 100% certainty, then I'll just sit and wait and see what happens.
Why do you think that is?
Good question. It could be, I mean, and I'm just throwing this out there, but it could be also that the people don't want to act on climate change. It's adaptation, for instance, it's not a priority. It's like, we're talking about something that's likely to happen in the future. How am I going to tell my, the people who elect me? And this is the electoral cycle is one of the, I think, biggest barriers often for this kind of long-term change and long-term thinking. And that's why we always say, like, for climate adaptation, and some countries are doing this. So UK, Finland, they actually are putting climate change legislation in place that cannot be overturned easily. So there is that kind of long-term policy commitment to reduce emissions and also to do the national adaptation plans and actually starting to invest in adaptation over the long term. But I think a lot of times, yeah, I mean, climate change is very complex. It's, and there's big parts that are uncertain, but I think we are seeing increasingly every year, or every time IPCC comes up with a new assessment, they say, well, now it's even more certain that, that emissions are, increasing and we are not on the path where we're supposed to be. And then, that's, and it's gone to the point that some scientists have said, well, do we need the working group one? Do we need the climate science to every assessment say, well, it's getting worse? Because they feel like we are not being listened to. But I think, so I think that goes back to, the points we discussed on imagination, but also values and priorities. And as long as, people in the communities are kind of, I have 99 problems, so don't bring me more. I think for me, what would be a game changer would be that adaptation thinking would be kind of part of people's everyday, thinking in terms of, and we are seeing that starting to happen in the insurance and the banking sector, looking at climate risks already in different neighborhoods. It's sometimes at the household level, and they go, we might have to pull out from this region or from this area. But then there are also kind of adaptation is starting to be incorporated as well. So they're saying, well, if you can show us that your operations or your house is more climate resilient, so you're actually putting in adaptation strategies in place, then we will reduce your premiums. And we will, recognize that that's kind of part of the asset value as well.
So a funny anecdote maybe here. Before this episode, I contacted my local town administration office to ask about the climate plans and like the climate adaptation plans. First of all, I was like really excited to know that they made plans in 2017 already. I was a little bit surprised that it was a very lengthy document. The only thing is, it looked a little bit like that those exercises that you need to do in university and you like half-ass towards the end. The biggest question I have now for them is like following up on that, like making sure there's more spaces where water can go through and seep through, and we have less pavements and all of that. They actually put on new streets and put on new regions where, so if you would have a magic wand, what would be a solution for those problems?
So a lot of the conversation around adaptation progress comes down to, first planning. Like we obviously need the plans to understand what we are supposed to be doing, but then also investment. So how do we then start actually implementing the plans? And I think that's often, that is the weak point. But I think if we can shift the conversation around, because everything they say, oh, but it's going to cost this much, it's going to cost this much. When we look at some of the scenarios, like if you have no adaptation, like
it's going to cost a lot more.
It's going to cost a lot more. And we know that already. And so I think the good example is like Copenhagen. So they had this massive rain event and so much flooding, and they were looking at the damages, but they were also looking at future scenarios, and they're like, okay, actually, if we invest now in a proper, like we make the drainage in the city bigger and we rethink how we manage the water, like we're going to save in the future. We're going to save so much money, but we need to do the investment, and they did that. Often the conversation is very like, because some of the benefits of adaptation will not come in the next 4 years. they will maybe, come in the next 10 years. And it is, so the timescale aspect of adaptation is often quite difficult to explain. It's like, why do we need this investment now? It's like, because, if you look at increasing, rainfall in the area, or increasing drought in your area, and if you have nothing in place, like, you cannot keep the people and ecosystem safe, or you have to come up with very, very expensive ways then, in the future. But there is this kind of time lag as well. And so when we talk about adaptation benefits, they don't happen, necessarily for this generation. And they might happen, in 20 years from now. And so who's around to say, yes, I was the mayor, I made the investment, and now 30 years later, look at my legacy. But I think we do need to start thinking about, what are the legacies that adaptation can leave for the communities and for the ecosystems.
Tom, I like your how you asked what your local climate strategy was. I wish I could do that in Texas, but nobody here actually believes in climate change, so I doubt we have anything like that. Something that stood out to me was the idea that this takes sometimes the effects won't be seen till multiple generations later, or at least 20, 30 years in the future. It's sort of joked about in the filmmaking world that if you're a really good audio tech on set, or you're a really good lighting person, and you really know how to light a scene, if you do your job right, the audience won't notice it. Yeah, exactly. If there's a really beautiful shot in a movie, people are just going to go, wow, that's a really beautiful shot. They're not really going to know why. They just know it's going to be beautiful. Whereas if you mess up the lighting, or you mess up the audio, or you mess up the camera settings, then it's really obvious something went wrong. One of the things with climate adaptation is that if you do it right, nobody will really know, because they're still living in that area and everything's fine. Whereas if you don't do it right, it's a desert, or it's underwater, and it's really obvious that something got screwed up along the way. I think about that a lot whenever it comes down to, putting up from a city's perspective, or a state's perspective, or something like that, where it's, we're going to put $1 billion forwards to do all of these adaptation things that we might not even know if it works, quote unquote, know if it works, because if it does work, then life will just sort of continue as normal. So I feel like quantifying that that's an interesting challenge.
No, absolutely. And I love that analogy, because it's very true. And it's the same for disaster risk reduction. So often we say, well, why do we have to do these investments now? We could spend the money on something else. And I think local level governments in particular, they're like a microcosmos of the society. It's like there's so many different priorities and values. And when you start talking about, and city that works, people don't notice the way, the mechanisms and processes that actually make it work. When it doesn't, everyone, kind of stops and goes, hang on, what's happening? So I think you're right. And in the public conversation, for instance, in Australia, I'm always very, I take a lot of media just to explain adaptation, because I think we do need to also recognize its role, but also start changing the conversation. Very difficult challenge for a politician, to put in all this investment and then not being able to show that I improved this road in this place. It's not, sometimes adaptation is not about just hard infrastructure. It's about, there's so many things that you do, for instance, with ecosystems that people don't really notice necessarily. So there's lots of images from all around the world where they have measured, for instance, a city where they only had roads and they have, car parks, and then they measured the temperature of the similar road somewhere where there is trees and lots of nature. And you can see the temperature differences, for instance. I think that's often quite a stark reminder for people how we build these environments that are not fit for humans or for ecosystems. And then you kind of get that. I think that always, it's a lot easier to explain what adaptation is when you have that stark contrast, and you can kind of show something rather than say, well, in 20 years time, you'll be much safer.
Yeah, because it's like how does what does that mean? I think people, especially if they don't think about that, if they're not like me or you or Tom, and we're walking around every day thinking about that, people are going about their lives, and if you try and explain that to someone, it's like, oh no, but you're gonna, it's gonna be so much better of an environment. Trust me, they're gonna go like, it's fine how it is now. Like I don't know, or maybe there's some small complaints they have. But yeah, I think using examples like that, where it's, isn't this part of town so much nicer where there's more parks or trees or, I think that's a good way to sort of get people thinking, at least on a small scale. Is there anything that you've seen in particular that's worked for you whenever you're trying to explain something? Maybe that could be to a policymaker, maybe that could be to just somebody who is in a position of power, that maybe they're like a business owner or they have influence. Is there any talking points or something like what you just mentioned that kind of works for you?
I think a lot of people are interested in the numbers. So when, for instance, I was on a call on private sector adaptation, and a lot of the times, because it's a climate-related financial disclosure, there is a kind of more common language around that. Well, what does that look like to your bottom line? What does that look like for your operations or your supply chain? Where are the climate risks, and what can you actually do? So I think a lot of the times having conversations around adaptation that are quite practical and going, you have all these risks that are, going to impact your company or your operations. How's your staff going to come to work if there's, like massive flooding all around the factory, or there's massive heat waves and they can't actually work in the factory or get to work anymore? So I think there's a lot of conversations around energy security. How do you make sure that, and that's kind of adaptation mitigation. So how do you make sure that you have a stable electricity system, for instance, in a factory, that can keep going even during heat waves and all that impact and pressure that it puts on the actual infrastructure. But it's also around the saving, I think. So well-being, but also conversations around that if you don't do the investments now, it's going to cost you a lot more. And I think that, I know that's market speak, but for a lot of those people, that's what they have to respond to. They have to go to their boards and their shareholders and say, there is an economic rationale to do adaptation. And I think the more we can target different types of messages in different decision contexts, I think that's when we kind of start seeing maybe more acceptance, more understanding around, well, what does adaptation actually mean to me? Or what does it mean for my company? Or what does it mean for my community? So I think the role of science communication in particular, and communication overall, I think it has such a massive role in how we can change the way that people think.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that a lot as well. People who have been around me, they will know how much I like to talk about science communication. And the next part that we'll look at actually is kind of an extension of this conversation. If we as scientists, creators, or anyone in between want to be more present in pushing the change that we need, whether that's our local communities or towards policymakers, we need to learn how to engage people. How do we lead people towards a better future? Especially when not all of us feel like we're born leaders or like we have the skills to do so. That's something I struggle with for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think there's different types of leadership, like you said. Like a lot of the times when we hear a leader, we think about a prime minister or we think about a CEO. Those are the leaders. And I feel like probably 2017, that was my view. And I was always thinking, but one day when I become a director, one day when I become, so we often think leadership in terms of positions. And I was reading, I think it was one of Brené Brown's books, and she talks about leadership, and she had a new definition. I nearly cried when I read that because I felt like I was leading, but then I felt timid because I'm like, but I'm not a professor, I'm not a director, I'm not a CEO. And her definition of leadership is anyone who kind of looks at other people's capabilities and propels them forward. And I felt like, for me, I'm like, so that is leadership. It's not position based. And I think a lot of the leadership literature and researchers are coming to that their leadership is about kind of stepping forward and taking initiative and seeing how you can bring others with you. And I know that some leaders talk about kind of leading from behind. So you actually empower other people, and that's leadership. You don't always have to be, you don't have to be the prime minister. You don't have to be a CEO. I think the kind of definition of leadership, our view of leadership, it's often, it's still very position based. And I think when it comes to the climate movement, I think we have to start recognizing that different people have really cool ideas. And I think the leadership part is about taking kind of some of those ideas and trying to help them grow. And I think that's kind of a nice way to think about leadership.
We feel very much like the bridge between different people and those generalists in between. And sometimes it is bringing those different types of people together in itself, which can be that part of leadership.
Yeah.
Is there something like training or education do you feel like could be useful if people want to move ahead with that and connect people or propel other people forward?
Yeah, so I would probably, there's so much out there. So I think when people say, I don't know where to start, that's completely understandable. I think always my first recommendation is search for the information. So for instance, there's an amazing podcast and called Coaching for Leaders. And that's been my absolutely favorite podcast for years. It's really focused on self-leadership, but also understanding different styles of leadership. And Dave Stachowiak, who's the host, I know him well, and he just does this amazing job of always being so humble and thinking this, he gets these great leadership gurus on the podcast, and all he always thinks is like, what does this person have in terms of insights that would be useful for anybody who's listening to this podcast? What can they learn, and how can he be the kind of vehicle of the bridge kind of in between that? And a lot of that conversation in that podcast is very much about, how can you kind of lead yourself better, but also how do you work in teams? What do you do when you have like massive conflict at work? So it's very much quite practical as well. There's so many resources out there in terms of leadership. And one of the really cool books that I read early on was on why are so many incompetent men leaders, and that's challenging the leadership research and the view that we have about leaders, because we look at, a lot of people look at old white men and they go, wow, like that's a leader, because they are so confident and a lot of them have charisma, but we don't always understand that doesn't always result in competence. So Tomas Zimmer, what's his name? Who wrote that book. So he basically says that a lot of women actually have a lot of the traits that are really seen in more inclusive leadership, leadership styles that actually lift other people. That's not to say that every single woman is like a better leader than a man, but it's just saying, like, trying to understand the different modes of leadership, but then also challenging some of those assumptions that we have. That it's not always confidence and charisma and being loud. Like, there are those leaders out there. And I think he was kind of explaining that from psychology perspective, that's probably what happened in the tribes when we lived in tribes, like there was the strong man making decisions. And then that's what we still think. We are like, oh, like he must be a good leader. But we've seen, in recent years, many of these types of leaders who turn out to be, not so great.
Where do these indigenous or local communities fit into this part? Because I feel like they have a very important voice that's not always coming through on a global scale. So
I think we have seen more and more focus, for instance, on indigenous knowledge in indigenous communities, certainly in the IPCC. So the last assessment was very much, we had indigenous authors as well, which was really, I think, a step forward. So I think the global conversation in the UN, the kind of indigenous and groups, communities, and local communities as well, they are pathways for having these conversations and bringing those voices as well. But I think it's also about, the research community. So I work closely with Associate Professor Meg Parsons from University of Auckland, who's Indigenous Maori scholar who's focusing on climate adaptation, but from the Indigenous perspective. And I've learned so much from her, and I've loved working with her because she has, every time we do something together, if we write on climate justice, there are so many different interpretations, what that means, in the communities where I live and work. And then something that's, so that might be a completely different concept. And we did some work on transformation a few years ago. And a lot of the Indigenous participants said, well, transformation for us is a negative word. Like, I know everybody's now like, oh, we have to transform the world and we have to transform. And they said, we have been transformed for generations by colonialism, so we have always been transformed. So now we would like not to transform anymore, but we would like to, find our own, have our own voice. So I think it's also about, learning to respect the different views and knowing that a lot of the terms that we use might not fit, or they might trigger a different type of imagination for somebody else than what we actually intend to. And I do see that in global conversations where especially using images sometimes triggers a lot of resistance, and they go, well, that's not the future for people in developing countries. But then the conversation, I feel like, needs to be, well, what are the common shared elements of humanity that we would like to see? And I think a lot of the conversations around resilient, affordable, accessible health services, clean water, clean environment, human and well-being of nature. I think there are these kind of common goals and common aspirations that we can have.
Since we've been talking about dreaming, since we're talking about these vision exercises, is there like an example that the people can do at home to really get into that mindset and that mindscape of let's think about the future, that maybe you do when you do a workshop or something like that?
One of the really good videos is from and I can share the link for the video, it's on Resilience Frontiers. And they kind of run you through first, well, what could the world look like if we had no climate action?
This is the only future we can picture. Biodiversity in nature will become depleted beyond repair.
If we did not want to make change, what would that world look like? And it's kind of like, look, it's at the global scale. But then they flip in the middle, they go, but what if we actually make these changes? What would that future look like?
But all this can be reversed. There will always be enough for us and nature too.
And then there's other talks on Resilience Frontiers by Dr. Yusuf Nassef, who's the founder of Resilience Frontiers, and a lot of that is so inspiring, and that's what I use at my teaching as well. When I teach future visioning, it's very much about how can we imagine what a thriving world looks like, and that's the question. I feel like everything is kind of leading back to that question for me now.
I think that segues absolutely perfectly into what I was going to ask. So I want to know from you, it's the Earth, it's 2060. Everything worked out. What do you see for you personally?
I think I don't know if it's lame. I feel like it's just what I see is sunshine and clean water, like blue, clean water. If I'm walking in a coastal landscape, I see this like super multi-species thriving coastal environment that kind of accommodates, lets nature be nature, but then also lets humans just be in that environment and enjoy that. And I do see buildings, but they would be, for instance, situated in nature. So covered, like green, new designs that actually look amazingly beautiful, but do all these other kind of ecosystem functions at the same time. So I see a lot of like blended designs and blended architecture. Short answer, if I'm imagining like a coastal city.
Let's do it. Let's make it happen.
This is where we put in a visual from Midjourney or something.
And then we make the AI that's consuming all of the fresh water from their servers to paint a picture.
That's for a different episode on AI, and let's not open the Pandora's box right here. But now it's actually your turn. If you made it to this part of the podcast, we want to do this vision exercise with you as well. So here it is again. It's 2040. We made it. How do you think your local city will look like? Let us know in the comments below, or if you're listening to this on an audio podcast, you can leave a comment now on Spotify or just DM us the answer on Instagram. So one more time, it's 2040, we made it. How do you think your local city will look like? We'll try to collect all of those answers and share that back on social media. You can find all the details also to the resources from Johanna and her research in the show notes. And next time, we're going to get frisky. We're going to zoom in for a change and look at how scientists are actually doing the research to understand the effects of climate change, this time on a very, very local level. So excited for that. I'm going to see you there.